This is the KNBC News Service sign-off edition for a Friday morning, the 4th of April. The time in 20 seconds, 2:02 a.m. And the stories topping the news to this hour. Saigon says a plot has been smashed, a plot aimed at overthrowing President Thieu. The first group of Vietnamese orphans arrive in this country, and President Ford talks about the plight of the refugees in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government announced it has smashed an attempt to overthrow the president, Nguyen Van Thieu. A number of South Vietnamese military officers have been arrested. The reports of the coup came shortly after Catholic protesters took to the streets of Saigon to demand Thieu's removal. Police fired over the heads of demonstrators to break up the crowd. The U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General Frederick Weigand, left Saigon on his return flight to Washington. The general pledged more U.S. aid to the South Vietnamese. Weigand was sent to Saigon to assess South Vietnamese government losses to the communists. Before his departure, he termed the loss of 60% of South Vietnamese territory to the enemy a sound strategic action by Saigon's troops. Communist diplomats report the Viet Cong is prepared to stop fighting and open immediate negotiations if Thieu is removed from office. In Geneva, the Viet Cong asked the International Red Cross and UNICEF for urgent aid for South Vietnamese civilians under its control. The first group of Vietnamese orphans to arrive in this country spent their first hours in an army barracks in San Francisco, but many of them are already with their new parents. A contingent of orphans arrived just hours ago at L.A. International Airport. 17 Vietnamese orphans left San Francisco to meet their new parents. They were escorted by members of the Friends of Children of Vietnam, the Colorado-based organization that placed these children in an adoptive home. At LA International, they were met by a crush of noisy news camera crews. Despite the confusion, 2 children met their new families.
I can sing another one.
Hi, what do you got? What is Boy, she looks serious. Look at her hair's grown.
Yeah. Is this yours?
Yeah. When we got out of the orphanage, they shaved her head.
She's a sweetheart of a kid. She's so
You want to play with her?
Yeah. She's had a drink of water, and her instructions are here. She's got some stuff here. She was examined by doctors in the Presidio. So good shape.
How long is it?
Wait, I'm losing my diaper.
How long? About a year.
The other 15 children boarded a plane for Atlanta, where they met their new parents in the early morning hour. An hour later, the scene was repeated on a smaller scale as 3 Los Angeles area couples met their adopted children. They had been adopted privately and were brought to the United States by Mary Fisher, wife of a Seventh-day Adventist missionary. It was confusing, exciting, and emotional for these new families, but for these children at least, it was the end of a long, frightening journey.
The last American is out of Saigon, and there's been no response from the Viet Cong to the surrender of South Vietnam by President Minh. We'll have details at 11 o'clock here on 4.
This is an NBC News special report. 7,382 days in Vietnam. Now from the NBC News Center in New York, here is John Chancellor.
February the 12th, 1955 was the day American advisors were first dispatched to Vietnam. Today, 7,382 days later, was the day it ended in Vietnam for the Americans and apparently for the government of South Vietnam. It looks as though all the government Americans are gone, all the contract civilian workers gone, taken out by a fleet of 81 helicopters guarded by 800 Marines on the ground and American planes and gunships in the air. About 900 to 1,000 Americans were taken out in 13 hours. At the same time, approximately 5,500 South Vietnamese were taken out. NBC News correspondent Jim Laurie is one of the few Americans still left in Saigon, in the city when President Duong Van Minh went on the radio and told the Viet Cong that his country would surrender unconditionally and that he had told its army to lay down its arms. Here from Saigon Radio Hookup is Laurie's report on the surrender.
At approximately 10 in the morning, Saigon time, the acting president of South Vietnam, General Dung Van Minh, took to the airwaves nationwide to announce an unconditional surrender to the Viet Cong. In the words of General Minh, we are here to hand over the power of government to you in order to avoid bloodshed. General Minh called on all Saigon troops to lay down their arms and remain in place. This apparently is an invitation now to the forces of the communists to enter the city from the outskirts and take over power. It is a unilateral ceasefire and an unconditional surrender, the first hope that we have now that the 30-year war in South Vietnam is at last over. We have just come back from the U.S. Embassy just a few minutes ago, and the scene at the U.S. Embassy here in Saigon is total chaos. At 8 o'clock this morning, we witnessed apparently the last of the American helicopters taking off from the roof of the embassy. Earlier it was thought that everybody, that is all Americans who wanted to go, had left the embassy compound, but apparently during the night there were a number of U.S. Marines who remained behind on the roof. So at approximately 8 o'clock this morning, this Chinook helicopter from one of the carriers off the coast came in. We saw it land on the top of the embassy roof, and it took off the last few remaining Marines at the U.S. Embassy. The situation was very difficult indeed. The U.S. Marines, as they left, threw tear gas canisters into the embassy, trying to keep back thousands of South Vietnamese. The Vietnamese had surged into the embassy and by now have taken the embassy thoroughly apart. We attempted to get into the embassy to look around. We got as far as the first floor, and there we saw on the floor a smashed portrait of President Ford. Also on one of the staircases was an American flag, torn and soiled. The Vietnamese had surged into the embassy. They were taking everything that they could find. They mounted the stairs, and at last report, they were on the roof. Jim Laurie, NBC News, Saigon.
The decision to use helicopters in the last airlift was taken by President Ford when it became apparent that because of shelling and panicked refugees, the Saigon airport would not be possible for fixed-wing transports. So the helicopters and the Marines went in. Charles Quinn of our staff is in Washington now, and he has more on the story of those Marines who nearly got left behind. Charles, will you tell us about that?
Right, late this afternoon, John, after the President's announcement, I was startled to learn that there were still Marines in Saigon at the embassy, a small number, I think around 30. I was told that there had been small arms fire, that they were having problems with large numbers of Vietnamese who wanted to go out with them, go out at the end, and they were sort of, it was implied that they were sort of fighting them off. There's still no word here about whether any of those Marines were hurt and whatever occurred at the end, and the details are sketchy. I understand reports out of Saigon say that there were no Marine injuries.
In what you've learned from officials in Washington, Chuck, was the timing, did it take longer than they had expected or predicted, this airlift?
It took about twice as long as they had originally predicted, John. They had been talking last week about 8 or 9 hours, but they were talking then in terms of evacuating about 1,500 Americans. Well, today there were 1,000 Americans left, so it would seem that it would take 8 or 9 hours, but it took 18, which leads you to believe that the extra time was spent picking up 5,500 South Vietnamese. Now, the Pentagon people will say it was raining, it became dark and confusing and so forth, but that extra 5,500 South Vietnamese was important in causing it to be longer than it was.
Thank you, Chuck. Interesting details, and I'm sure we'll get more in the days to come. Arthur Lord of NBC News has been in Saigon recently and got out under fairly scary circumstances and has made his way to Bangkok. And he's there now on the satellite circuit, and I'd like to ask him 1 or 2 questions. Arthur, how did you get out?
Well, John, I think it's safe to say that I escaped. I was at the airport trying to deliver some film to Bangkok by a commercial flight, and we also had a charter on standby, when suddenly the airport was bombed by airplanes with Vietnamese Air Force markings. So the airport authorities closed the field because they couldn't tell which airplane was friend or foe, and so we had to spend the night at Tan Son Nhut. That was a mistake because the North Vietnamese immediately began rocketing the place, and we took about 150 rounds of incoming fire during the night, which did quite a bit of damage to the field. The barrage lifted shortly after 8 a.m., and we just scrambled aboard the airplane and took off, and fortunately landed here in Bangkok, and very delighted to be here.
We're delighted to have you there, Arthur. You made some film of the bombing by aircraft of Tan Son Nhut Airport. Could you show us that now?
Yes, John, I believe we can show you the film at this time. This film, which we're about to see, there it is, was shot just outside the gate of Tan Son Nhut. Our cameras were not allowed inside. The bombing of the airport was a complete surprise to the South Vietnamese. The sneak attack was carried out by 3 airplanes, all with Vietnamese markings. Most people believed that they were turncoat Vietnamese Air Force pilots who flew the planes. People were shooting at every kind of airplane in the air, even this little transport. And while all that was going on, there was tremendous explosions at the field. This is because a great deal of damage was done in the raid, even though only 3 planes took part in it. Meanwhile, in downtown Saigon, there was quite a bit of panic. People began running through the streets, not knowing what they were doing. There were rumors all over the place, and first people thought that the North Vietnamese MiGs were bombing the palace, and then the rumors spread that there had been a coup organized against the new government. But these rumors, although they persisted for a while, were finally squashed. The problem was really here that the authorities lost complete control of the situation, and there was no way that they could control the people.
Vietnam, a war that is finished.
We should alert you that some scenes in our next report may not be suitable for viewing by young children.
Without the bombs being dropped, the communists would probably eat us alive down there. And it's either them or us, the way I feel about it. If the war wasn't being fought here, it'd be fought somewhere else.
You really think the bombs then are keeping the communists away? It is that important?
Well, I can't say it's keeping them away. It's keeping them beat back to where they should be.
Do you think it's effective?
Of course it's effective, or they wouldn't be doing it.
The demand for specialized medical services in South Vietnam overwhelmed the availability. Those who did get help were lucky, as we found out in Quang Ngai. John and Trop have been friends for a long time. They are both 11 years old and were living in the village of Binh Duc, doing the things that young country girls do in Vietnam, playing together, working together, children of poor parents. Now they suffer and hope together. The report at the Quaker Rehabilitation Center reads, on February 19th, 1971, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the 2 girls and 2 other friends left their village to go to market to sell wood. While they were walking along the road, a South Vietnamese soldier heard their voices, thought they were the enemy, and detonated a mine. Reports that the war has wound down may seem fanciful to those who crowd the hospital wards. In the first 3 months of this year, the latest period for which statistics were made available to CBS News, more than 10,000 civilians were wounded and hospitalized. Mrs. Ero Kubica, wife of the center's director, is a physical therapist with 4 years' experience in Vietnam. What will happen, do you think, to Tra and Chan, 2 little girls we've seen here?
Chan will probably be fine because she has just one leg below the knee, lost one leg below the knee. So I think she'll just lead a fairly normal life, be able to go to market and do all the things that she would expect to do. The sad thing may be that her marriage prospects may be affected by being a disabled person. And that, of course, will be sad for her when she's older. The other little one will have a much harder time. Walking for her will always be difficult. She should walk almost normally, but she won't be able to walk very far. And so she'll manage all right, but she won't do as well as Chan.
To see the agony and heartbreak of those 2 young girls, Chan and Tra, was to see the war in human terms, stripped of its philosophical, political, and geographical meaning. In terms of the human tragedy, the peace cannot retrieve what the war has claimed. There was no shortage of innocent victims in that war. It is estimated that more than 178,000 South Vietnamese, mostly civilians, had been disabled, including 80,000 persons who are amputees, 30,000 who are blind, 10,000 who are deaf. For them, for those thousands, including Chan and Tra, the end of the war will not mean the end of the suffering.
Our broadcast will continue with a look at the events of 1972 and 73 after this message.
Once again, here is CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite.
And once again, we should alert you that some scenes in our next report may not be suitable for viewing by young children. The year was 1972. This was the year of Watergate, the year of Richard Nixon's landslide re-election. And again, it was a year of death in Vietnam. Charles Collingwood reports.
In early 1972, the Paris peace talks were still stalemated, but not the battlefield. With the advent of spring in 1972 and the dry campaigning season, the North Vietnamese launched their annual end-of-March offensive across the demilitarized zone against the northernmost South Vietnamese provinces. With American troops drawn down now to below 100,000, the North Vietnamese were testing the ability of the South Vietnamese forces to fight on their own. It was close-quarter combat and very fierce, as Bob Simon reported from Route 1 south of Quang Tri.
The ranking South Vietnamese officer quickly decides the communists have been flushed out. He urges his men forward to finish them off. The decision is premature. The officer is the first to fall, an AK round in the chest. Then what everyone had been waiting for, a North Vietnamese soldier in the open, on the run. The men open up with everything they have. From the amount of fire coming at them, government troops had thought they were facing at least a company of North Vietnamese regulars. It turns out to be just a couple of platoons on another suicide mission. One by one, the men blow up the bunkers with hand grenades. They examine the bodies and sift through the belongings. There's a wounded soldier in one of the bunkers, but the men are in no mood to take prisoners. Up the road, civilians sense that the fighting is over, that the road is open. They come racing down on motorcycles and trucks. Another premature decision. AK fire rings out from a distant bunker. And the communists still have another surprise. The road is mined. It's mined to prevent tanks from coming down, but mines are not very discriminate. A truckload of refugees goes up in smoke. Women, children, babies. Some are dead, some are not dead. By evening, government spokesmen are saying another grand victory has been won in Quang Tri province. The situation is once again stabilized. But there will be more fighting and more words. Words spoken by generals, journalists, politicians. But here on Route 1, it's difficult to imagine what those words can be. There's nothing left to say about this war. There's just nothing left to say. Bob Simon, CBS News, Route 1.
In January of 1973, 4 years of truce talks ended with the signing of the Paris peace agreements. That agreement had not come easily. It followed a year of renewed bombing of the North and the mining of Haiphong Harbor. President Thieu had resisted the agreement. He felt it gained him little. But the United States at least was getting its prisoners back. As the last American POWs were released, Walter Cronkite was in Hanoi.
On the last day of captivity, the prisoners were inspected by this ceasefire's International Control Commission, a formation outside their cells, the half-dressed men grim, unsmiling. Then, seemingly to a silent signal, they marched to their cells. One grasped my hand in passing, only to have a guard break our grip. The paleness of the prisoners seemed to contradict the camp authorities' claim they exercised and played games morning and afternoon. He said, too, that the Americans fought among themselves, but mostly during basketball games. This inspection and the flock of American newsmen may have surprised the prisoners. They seemed somewhat dazed by it all. But the guards said they were told last week they'd be going home in a few days if nothing happened. We weren't supposed to talk with them, but we managed to sneak in a few words before guards broke it up. These with Master Sergeant James Goff of Fresno, California.
December 27th. B-52. When was the first you knew about a ceasefire?
5 days after it was signed, yes.
So you had reasonable feeling you're going to go out pretty soon, huh?
Outside the camp, a large crowd in holiday, not unfriendly spirits, gathered to await the prisoners' departure in their camouflage buses. Their route took them past some of their own work, the bomb-damaged Longbian Bridge, and past the destroyed railroad repair yards, and then on to the airport. As the buses stopped outside the airport, the quick, illegal conversations renewed, like questions as to who won the Super Bowl and how other teams were doing.
How are the Boston Bruins doing? Boston Bruins, how are they doing? Boston Bruins, that's not my team. I don't know. No.
Just glad to see Americans. And then the North Vietnamese guards used their last minutes of authority to shut off the conversation again.
Those are the last known American prisoners of war. That part of the Vietnam tragedy is over. But they leave behind 1,300 others missing in action. There's not much hope that many of them survive. But now the grim search begins to try to account for everyone, if possible. But for these men, it is now the flight to freedom and on to Clark Field, the Philippines. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, Hanoi, North Vietnam.
The return of the war prisoners was about all that America's long and costly effort in Vietnam had come down to. I made some 17 trips to Vietnam between 1960 and 1972, and I gradually became convinced that we were going about our business there in the wrong way, and that our preoccupation with military victory was unlikely to create the conditions for a viable, independent, democratic South Vietnam, which was our stated goal. In the mid-60s, while we were winning battles, the fabric of South Vietnamese society was already visibly coming apart at the seams. Some perceptive American and South Vietnamese officials were trying to do something about it. Early in 1966, I did a long television examination of all this. It was called The Other War. General Westmoreland, a commander whom I admired as a professional soldier, took me to task for this. Charles, he said, you ought to know very well, there are not two wars here, there is only one, the military war. These people aren't going to build a better society until they're militarily secure. General Westmoreland's adversary, North Vietnam's General Vo Nguyen Giap, took a precisely opposite view. He saw the social structure as the basis for the military effort, not the other way around. For his side, what I called the other war was always of equal importance. In the end, General Giap had the right of it. It was South Vietnam's unattended social and political structure which broke before their armed forces did.
This year, 1975, brought the final chapter of the Vietnam War. There had never really been a ceasefire. Almost from the very beginning, both sides were accusing the other of truce violations. And then, less than 2 months ago, it all came apart.
The collapse of South Vietnam was sudden, almost incredibly so. The North Vietnamese began their offensive on March the 4th. Within 2 weeks, President Thieu had decided to abandon much of his country, the northernmost provinces and the Central Highlands. The withdrawal quickly became a rout, civilians and soldiers fleeing in panic, seeking whatever safety they could find, leaving behind huge supplies of American-made war materials. Many of the refugees sought safety in Da Nang, only to discover they were trapped there. They crowded the Da Nang airport, trying to claw their way onto the last flights out. Bruce Dunning filed this report.
As soon as the rear stairway was lowered, the stampede of terrorized people tried to storm the plane. From the cockpit, the pilots reported by radio that the situation was out of control. Several times the pilots moved the plane, hoping to break the crowds around the rear ladder. There was no control. High-ranking officers in Da Nang have fled, leaving soldiers and airmen to fend for themselves. As men clambered over one another, pushing aside women and children in their panic-stricken fury, members of the air crew dragged them onto the plane, trying to fill it as fast as possible. The tension and panic intensified. The heavily armed men were menacing. They left their wives, their children, their aged parents on the runway while they forced their own way on board, a rabble of young enlisted men. CBS News cameraman Mike Marriott and soundman Mai Van Duc dared not leave the plane, aware they might not be able to get back on. Stewardesses dragged people on and rushed them to seats, screaming all the while, "Where are the women and children?" They piled 4, 5, and 6 men into seats intended for 3. Finally, there was room for no more. The plane began to move as people still clambered up the ladder. Angry men left behind fired pistols and automatic weapons at the plane, determined that no one would go if they couldn't. A grenade went off under one wing, damaging it. Unable to move on the blockaded runway, the plane raced down the taxiway, swerving to avoid abandoned vehicles, perhaps even running over people. As the plane strained laboriously into the air, people were still clinging to the wheels and the rear stairs. 7 men fell off as the plane reached heights of 1,000 feet or more. As the plane reached 6,000 feet, 1 man was still stuck in the ladder. As calm fell on the smug men who had managed to fight off their friends and relatives to get on, the hard-working cabin crew took account. 268 people were on board, among them 5 women and 2 or 3 small children. The rest were some of the men whom President Thieu said would defend Da Nang. Once in flight, the pilots assessed the damage to the plane. Bullets had damaged gas lines and the plane was losing fuel. The pilots were not sure the wheels would function on landing because people had attempted to hide in the wheel wells. The flight from Da Nang to Saigon normally takes about 50 minutes. This one took more than an hour and a half. Another World Airways plane flew alongside trying to assess the damage and reported that the cargo hatches were open and full of people.
Do you think the nose gear will come down, or you can't tell yet? Can't tell. I don't want to check it till we get in closer. That's the biggest problem I see at the moment here. Long 945, clear to Saigon. Something hanging down in the gear, and my gear doors. It may be a body. Did you say a body? Well, I can't tell. It sure looks like it.
Not knowing whether the wheel assemblies would hold, the flight crew put the plane, almost empty of fuel, down very gingerly on the runway at Saigon, and the deserters on board cheered. As the plane taxied to a parking place, soldiers poured out of the luggage holds. As cameraman Marriott was filming the unloading, a South Vietnamese Air Force security officer arrested him for taking these pictures. The Air Force had things under control again. But the men and women of World Airways had brought their plane and its load home. Bruce Dunning, CBS News, back from Da Nang.
In the waning days of the Vietnam War, an airlift of orphans began. Perhaps they, at least, could escape in time to a new life. But the most heartbreaking tragedy of the war was yet to come. A plane load of orphans crashed. Murray Fromson reported that story.
2 hours ago, I watched this airplane take off from Tansanut Air Base. It was a perfect takeoff, carrying those orphans to the United States. What can one say except, when will the misery in this country ever stop? The huge plane crashed into a field about 5 miles from the end of the runway, near a small village in Jodin province. There were pieces of wreckage scattered across a half a mile of rice paddy. A fire was slowly burning itself out near the engines. Smashed bodies or parts of them were uncovered by Vietnamese Air Force crews and American officials who rushed to the scene. It was like a combat operation. Helicopters hovered overhead. Body bags were used to remove corpses for identification purposes. Other helicopters came back to Tan Son Nhut Air Base, where the ill-fated trip had begun. American and Vietnamese volunteers removed some of the body bags and other bodies wrapped in white sheets. Scores of ambulances rushed survivors to a nearby hospital. Some of the chaperones were in a state of shock. Moments before, they had been happy to be leaving Saigon. The orphans were to be the first of 2,000 to be airlifted out of Vietnam. Many were mixed blood, the children of Vietnamese women and black American GIs. They would never have had a chance for happiness in Vietnam, where racial prejudice is as strong as in any other country. Now, they have no chance at all.
Vietnam, a war that is finished. Our broadcast will continue after station identification. Join Mike Wallace and Morley Safer on 60 Minutes, Sunday at 6, 5 Central on CBS.